Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lord of the Rings AMA podcast. My name is Matthias Austin, and on this podcast, I do my best to answer any questions you have about Middle-earth, Lord of the Rings, and the wider legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien. You can submit questions to me at lotramapod@gmail.com, lotramapod@gmail.com, just like this week's question, which comes from Sean in Minnesota. Sean asks, what's the creation story of Middle-earth? Is this contentious to the inhabitants of the Tolkien cinematic universe, or is it just accepted as fact? Thank you, Sean, for that question. Your use of the Tolkien cinematic universe throws some wrenches into what could otherwise be a kind of straightforward answer, but I will do my best to navigate those when we get there. So as for the creation story we are given about Middle-earth, this is what is laid out in the published Silmarillion. Specifically in the first chapter, the Ainulindale, which means the Song of the Ainur, and the Valaquenta, or the Tale of the Valar. So here we go. Before time, Ilúvatar, father of all, also called Eru, which means the One, he that is alone, dwelt and still dwells in the timeless halls. He created the Ainur, meaning holy ones, angelic spirits. These spirits had individual minds and names and personalities, and they were created to do the work of Ilúvatar. Now, a little side note already, to talk about the time frame within the Timeless Halls is impossible to do, because while things happen in a sequence and an order, you can't really ever say when something happened, because when doesn't exist in the Timeless Halls. So don't think about that too much, or you'll kind of hit a existential crisis, but we'll go through the order that events happen, but I couldn't say when something happened, if that makes sense. So Eru Ilúvatar creates the Ainur, angelic spirits, meaning holy ones. Ilúvatar began to teach the Ainur music, with a capital M, the great music of Ilúvatar. And as the Ainur learned, they began to sing with it, with sometimes singing the melodies, sometimes in harmonies, sometimes solo, sometimes a couple of them together, but always listening to and sort of centering themselves, attuning themselves to the theme of the great music. Now, one of the Ainur, Melkor, sought to create his own music, which his own theme that was not attuned to Ilúvatar's music. Melkor often had spent time in the void, which is beyond the timeless halls, searching for the flame imperishable, what Ilúvatar used to create everything. What he used to create the Ainur, that's the flame imperishable. Melkor is searching for that out in the void, but he couldn't find it because the flame imperishable isn't in the void, it is with Ilúvatar. So, as the music is being taught, this great theme of music that the Ainur are all learning together, Melkor starts to do his own thing. He sings his own chorus, and it's out of tune, it's out of sync with what Ilúvatar is teaching them and what the other Ainur are singing. And so there's this big strife in this first theme of the great music, as some of the other Ainur start to listen more closely to Melkor's music than Ilúvatar's music. And so it gets chaotic, right? But then Ilúvatar smiled, and he held up his hand, and he began a new theme. And this theme took all of the strife that Melkor had put into his and wove it into the larger music in a way that Melkor never could have imagined. Now, in the second theme, Melkor again inserts his own music, and again there's discord and strife, and Ilúvatar frowns, holds up his right hand, and he begins a third theme, again incorporating Melkor's theme into something new and more beautiful than Melkor could have ever done on his own. In the third theme, Melkor again sings his own music, and with those that follow him, and it becomes so chaotic and cacophonous. The noise gets so loud, there's so much discord. Eventually, Ilúvatar stands up with a terrible expression on his face, and one final chord is played, which is described as being deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Ilúvatar. And then silence falls. At a certain point after this, Ilúvatar tells the Ainur that the music that they had just played was in fact the music of time, and contained within it was all that would ever come to pass in the history of the world. Kind of. There's some things that actually operate outside of the music, but for the most part, within the music is contained everything that is going to happen in the world. And he gives them a vision of this history. And all of the Ainur, they can each see how it unfolds. And they see the coming of the children of Iluvatar, which are elves and men. And they're just full of amazement at this, that these new beings will be created, elves and men, the children of Iluvatar. But the vision is taken away from them before they can see the end of it. So they don't know how time will end. And then Iluvatar says, Ea, which is Elvish for, let these things be. And in the void, what was outside of the timeless halls, in the void they can now see the world, Arda, but it's empty. And Iluvatar tells the Ainur that they're going to be the ones who go down there to physically create the visions they had seen. I love this about Tolkien. It's kind of sneaky, because he himself was a devout Catholic. Monotheistic, that's the only way to go, right? That he devout Catholic, and so it would be awful for him to create a world where there wasn't one singular God. But he also loves mythology, and so he creates this idea of, well, there's one God, but he's going to send these very powerful holy beings to do things like carve out mountains, and he creates like a pantheon. So he gets best of both worlds, which is very fun for me. So the Ainur are given the chance to descend to Arda, the world, but on the condition that once they enter it, they will enter time, and they will then be bound to the world of Arda and cannot leave it as long as it exists. So they're basically giving up this dwelling in the presence of Iluvatar in the Timeless Halls. They can't come back as long as Arda exists. They have to go down there. If they go down there, they have to stay down there for the duration of the time the world exists. And many choose to stay in the Timeless Halls, but many go. And the most powerful of the Ainur that go are known as the Valar. The less powerful of the Ainur that go are called the Maiar. So your Valar are the most powerful people going down there. The Maiar are less powerful. Melkor, he goes along, and he says, hey, I want to help you guys. That's a great vision we all just saw of the Earth. I want to be in on that. And for some reason, despite the fact he was causing all of this strife when they were first creating the music, the other Valar trust him. So the Valar go down to Arda, and they take on physical forms when they want to, because they're spirit beings, but they can, when they choose, put on physical forms, and in doing so, they become gendered. Not going to get into that, but they basically, when they create forms, those forms have a gender. And so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of who the Valar are. And there's 14 of them originally, so get ready for some names. 7 male Valar, lords of the Valar, 7 female ladies of the Valar. So the first one that goes down there, not the first one, they all go down at the same time, except for one, but the most important, the most powerful that goes down there of the Valar is Manwë. He is the king of the Valar, called the Lord of the Winds, and he is husband to Varda. We'll get to Varda a little bit later. I'm going through the lords first, then the ladies. Next up is Ulmo, Lord of the Water. He lives mostly as a spirit. He rarely puts on the form of his body. He lives as a spirit in the depths of the ocean, and he doesn't really come out except for very important moments. Next up is Aule the Smith. He's the Lord of the Earth. He's the guy who creates the Dwarves. That's a whole other episode, but he creates the Dwarves. And he is the husband to Yavanna. Orome is the huntsman. He's the Lord of the Forests. And he's the husband of Vanna. Not Yavanna, Vanna. We got Varda, Vanna, Yavanna. A lot of the names sound similar. So maybe go back 30 seconds, couple minutes, and start taking notes. Probably should have said that at the beginning of this little segment. But otherwise, don't worry about it, because only some of them actively pop up in the different stories of Middle-earth. So that was Orome, huntsman, Lord of the Forest, husband of Vanna. Next up is a guy named Nemo, but he isn't called Nemo, he's called Mandos, which is where he lives. He lives in the halls of Mandos. His name is Nemo. He goes by Mandos. He's the doomsman of the Valar, which means he says prophecies. Maybe the Valar forget some of the things they saw when they were looking at the visions, and he remembers them better, and he says, this is what's going to happen, I prophesy this. He's also the judge of the dead, so when spirits die, they go to the halls of Mandos, he watches over them in the halls of Mandos. And he is the husband of Vaire. The last lord of the Valar is Urmo, but like Mandos, he is not called by his name, he's called by where he lives, and he lives in a place called Lorien. So Urmo, also called Lorien, is the lord of dreams and visions. And he is the husband of Este. Those are the lords of the Valar. These are the ladies of the Valar. First and foremost is Varda. She is the queen of the Valar. She is the creator of the stars. She is the wife of Manwë, and the elves view her as the most powerful, the one that they most adore and worship. She's the best in the eyes of the elves. Next up is Yavanna. Yavanna creates plants and trees. She's the wife of Aule, the smith, and they have a very complicated relationship. He doesn't really care much about trees, and he's like, trees would make good firewood for the forges that I need. And she's like, no, they're good in and of themselves. There's a very complicated relationship. If we do an episode about the dwarves, we'll talk more about that. Next up is Nienna. And Nienna is very interesting. Her whole deal is that she weeps for the hurts in the world and has pity. And pity, in our modern sense, is a negative thing. Like, oh, don't pity me. I don't want your pity. In the sense that Tolkien uses it in the traditional sense of the word, pity is when somebody who is more powerful than you empathizes with you who is less powerful and offers their assistance to you. It's a good thing. If a billionaire had pity, they would fund every single homeless shelter in the country, right? There is a natural discrepancy between the most, especially in Middle-earth, the most powerful and the least powerful. And when the powerful seek out the less powerful to help them, that's pity. And they learn that from Nienna. And she weeps over the hurts of the world and teaches pity. The next lady of the Valar is Vaire. She's the weaver. She records everything that happens in her tapestries. So all throughout time, she's just weaving the story of what is happening in the world in these tapestries. She is the wife of Mandos, the judge of the dead. The next lady of the Valar is Este. Her name in Elvish means rest. Her husband is Lorien, or Urmo, and he was the Lord of Dreams. So between them, they have rest and dreams, which is kind of nice. That's a nice little pairing there. The next lady of the Valar is Vanna. She is the sister to Yavanna. I know, but they're sisters, so that kind of works. How are they sisters when they were angelic spirits in Timeless Halls? Don't worry about it. Not explained. So she's a sister of Yavanna. Yavanna, who made the trees. Vanna makes flowers. She says wherever she goes, flowers spring from the ground. And she is the wife of Orome, the huntsman. Then the last lady of the Valar is Nessa. She is the ever young, it says. She dances, she runs with deer and is able to outpace all of them. In Greek mythology, I think that's Artemis. Just sort of this person who runs barefoot through the woods and races the animals. And she dances with wild abandon. That's Nessa. So I gave you 6 lords of the Valar and 7 ladies of the Valar, but I said 14 originally came down. And that is because Melkor was counted among the Valar when he came down. What would his role have been? Who knows? And what other names could he have? What titles? He gave himself a lot of titles. He called himself Lord of the Earth, King, he who rises in might. He gave himself all sorts of names. But what he could have been if he was good and did what he was supposed to, who knows? So he was the 14th that came down. So we got 6 lords of the Valar, 7 ladies of the Valar, and Melkor, who's doing his own thing. So those were the original Valar in Arda. And when they came down, they began to shape the world. They would build mountains and dig out oceans. They would plant, Yavanna would bring up great trees, and they would create rivers and valleys. And everything they did, at every step, Melkor began to sabotage it. Anywhere he could. He would burn down forests. He would tear down mountains. He would flood the land. He would raise up lakes and raise up valleys. And so in everything that the Valar tried to do, he tried to ruin it. But in doing so, he brings the other Valar together, and they create things that they never thought of on their own. For instance, one of the things that Melkor is able to do is he is associated a lot with fire and like heat and cold. It's like temperature, fire and the lack of fire, almost, you could say, right? And so he brings bitter colds to these regions, and the Valar are so sad because they're like, what is this? This is awful. And Iluvatar speaks to them and says, but would any of you have thought of snow? This mixing of winds, Manwë, and water, Olmo. These two wouldn't have thought to create this together, but because of this cold that Melkor is bringing in, they create these other things. So everything he tries to do, there actually is, it's sort of like in the music, whenever Melkor brought his own theme, Iluvatar would wrap that theme into a larger theme and create something beautiful. And that happened when they were creating the world. But eventually, he is getting so destructive and so bad that another Vala is the singular of Valar, there's 7 Valar, or 14 Valar, each one of them is a Vala. A different Vala is watching this from the Timeless Halls, and he's just getting so fed up with everything that he sees Melkor doing, he decides, I'm going to show up to help. And his name is Tulkas. This dude is very funny to me. He's a wrestler, and his whole deal, all he wants to do is beat up Melkor. He shows up just to fight him, and he laughs as he fights, and it said that Melkor hears the sound of his laughter, and he's like, oh, I gotta get out of here. So he ends up, Tulkas and the other Valar, but mainly Tulkas, end up driving Melkor out of the world, into the void outside of Arda. Like, we would say, to outer space, but I don't think it quite works like that in Tolkien's created world, right? So he drives him out. And with Melkor gone, the Valar finally finish creating the world. It doesn't go how they wanted it to. They had plans for how they wanted the world to look. But because of everything that Melkor did, it didn't quite work out how they wanted. But overall, they're pretty happy with it. And roughly speaking, what they create is one big landmass in the middle of massive oceans. And there's a pillar of light in the north and a pillar of light in the south. And those pillars give out light to the world. The sun does not exist at this point. The moon does not exist. There are stars, but you can't always see them because of the light from the lanterns. Also, the world is a flat disk. It's not round. You cannot circumnavigate the globe. If you go to the far west, there's another chunk of land there. You go to the far east, I think it's called like the gates of the, well, it's not called the gates of the sun yet, because there is no sun. But if you go to the east, there's another thing, kind of just like on the edge of the world, and then this big chunk of land in the middle. And so for most of the history of Middle-earth, because it takes a while for the Earth to become round, that's a whole other episode, for most of the history of Middle-earth, flat earthers would be correct. If they said the Earth is flat, yeah, it is. Actually, later on, you'd have to be like, no, the Earth is actually, it's round now, and that would be a crazy thing for people to be saying. So that's the world as they set it up. And they've got these big pillars that give out light to the world. And after they finish, Tulkas, who came down to beat up Melkor, he falls in love and marries Nessa. Nessa's the young, ever young, dances, runs faster than deer. And during the wedding celebration, when Tulkas is distracted, all the Valar are busy having a party, he comes down from the void with these spirits, the Maiar that he had brought over to his side. These are like the Balrogs. Probably at this point it's also Sauron. And he brings them down, and they set up this big fortress in the far north beyond the northern lamp, deep within the earth. It's called Autumno. And they set up another fortress sort of on the western edges of this big landmass. And that one is called Angband, which is a fun word to say. Angband. Probably sounds better in a British accent, but my Midwest, it's a lot of nasal sounds, and that's fun. So he sets up this deep, deep fortress of Autumno in the far north. And he waits for his moment, he gathers his strength, and then he attacks the northern pillar, and he knocks it down, and fire spreads across the land. There's a tumult, and there's earthquakes, and continents just split up, and ocean rushes in, and the Valar are worried like everything they were going to make is going to be destroyed. It isn't, but it's drastically changed from that first thing that they do. So whole new continents are made. The Valar flee to the land in the west. This is really roughly the way the Earth is set up at this point, the way Arda is set up. You have Aman in the west, which is where the Valar live. And in the middle is Middle-earth. And Middle-earth is not one continent. There's several continents that make up Middle-earth. Everything we see in The Lord of the Rings takes place in the extreme northwest of all of the lands of Middle-earth. And actually, things we see in the Silmarillion takes place in the even more northeast than that, but that land eventually gets destroyed. So, Aman is in the west, where the Valar live, also called Valinor, land of the Valar. Middle-earth is in the center and in the east, and then on the far side there's still a little bit of land, but we don't need to get into that yet, because the sun's not here, and that's the only time it becomes relevant. Which sounds confusing, I know, but trust me. Melkor, he lives in this fortress of Autumno in the north of Middle-earth, and in the northwest of Middle-earth he builds the fortress of Angband that looks out on the ocean over to the land of Aman, where the Valar live. And they build up these tall mountains called the Pelori Mountains to defend themselves from Melkor in the event that he tries to attack them. And in the land of Aman, the Valar make 2 trees. Yavanna makes them. Nessa weeps over them with her tears to cause them to grow. And these 2 trees are some of the most important things that happen in the history of Middle-earth. They have names. I'm not going to tell you the names because they're not. We don't need to go into that right now. There could be a whole episode about the trees. But one of these trees gives off gold light. The other one gives off silver light, and they kind of wax and wane so that there's a time when they're each on their own giving out light, and then so there's a time when they are together giving out light. But the light of those trees is blocked by the mountains that the Valar put up to protect Aman. And fun fact, the fruit of 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 one of those trees is the white tree that we see in Return of the King. That's the symbol of the royal house of Gondor. So that lineage stretches all the way back to those trees. And that's the only non-starlight in the entire world, and at this point many of the plants enter sort of a hibernation state. In the far east, the elves awaken in the dark, underneath the starlight, in a land called Cuiviénen. They were not created by the Valar. They are the first of the children of Ilúvatar. And the Valar actually view the elves not as subjects, but as their almost younger siblings, because they were both created by Ilúvatar. Now, I've talked for a while about this is the creation story. I could keep going, but I'm going to stop it here. Because in terms of creation mythology, this is where the mythology kind of starts blending with history. Because the elves are now here on the scene, and they will start recording what they actually do and see. So that's roughly the creation story that we are given in the Silmarillion. But before I can answer whether this is a contentious story or not, how many people believe this is the true story, I need to give you some background about how Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. So first off, Tolkien was not primarily an author. He was a philologist. A philologist is somebody who studies languages, how they spread, kind of like a linguist, but different. And he wanted to invent his own languages because he loved languages so much. And he believed, as a philologist, that for a language to be real, it needed to be connected to a real culture. culture shapes the language. And therefore, to have a convincing language, he needed to invent a people with a history and a world that would shape how the language developed. And these were the Elves. Additionally, Tolkien was a lover of mythology, and he was always kind of disappointed in what he felt was a lack of an English mythology. And I'm not saying like Celtic mythology or Norse or the mythology of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and all the people who came in to inhabit the land of Great Britain that would eventually become the British. He was English, and he was always sad there was no English mythology. So he wanted to make his own. So he combined these two passions, language and the idea of an English mythos, into his earliest writings. And these writings date back to when he was actually recovering from getting trench fever in World War I, and is well before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He would work on and off on these writings for the rest of his life. He would tweak things, rewrite, edit, scrapping whole sections of them, and eventually these would be collated into various collections by his son Christopher. The most complete of those was the Silmarillion. But some of the early drafts, the earliest stuff, was put into something called the Book of Lost Tales. Now, why am I telling you this? Because the Book of Lost Tales has a narrative framing device, and it sets up this framework that Tolkien would use in his books. In the start of that book, we get a story of an English sailor who finds himself stranded on a mysterious island where an elf takes him in and tells him the true stories of what happened in Middle-earth, which would one day become our modern world. Now, Tolkien eventually kind of abandoned this idea, not fully, but he never really fully fleshed it out either. I think in a letter to somebody, he said his estimate was that we are currently living in the 7th age, and everything we see in Lord of the Rings happens in the 3rd age. But he kind of leaves that idea behind. He doesn't focus on it too much. But he never left the idea of the framework. So, for instance, Tolkien, the real-life Tolkien, portrays Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, not as a writer, but as someone who is translating the Red Book of Westmarch, which was written by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam from a language called Westron, to English, and it chronicled the real-life events that happened in Middle-earth from the perspective of the hobbits. That's, when you're reading Lord of the Rings, you are reading a fictional translation of real events. So why is this relevant to the creation story of Middle-earth? Well, it's because Tolkien employs a similar literary device with the Silmarillion, which, again, was not a completed text like Lord of the Rings, but a compilation of these different stories of the First Age, of Middle-earth, that were all at various levels of completion when he died. And the framing with the Silmarillion is that these are the tales that the Elves told. It's a book from the Elvish perspective, as where history and myth combine, as many of the prominent people in them, like Galadriel, Elrond, Glorfindel, Círdan the Shipwright, they were all alive at the time much of the story occurred. But because it's this elvish story, we really only know what they were taught as the creation story. Within the fictional world, is this objectively what really happened? Well, probably, right? It probably is, but it is interesting that we don't get the perspectives of humans or dwarfs really much throughout all of Lord of the Rings, especially the Silmarillion. Early humans in the Silmarillion, when they show up, they give cryptic answers about where they came from, and they say, oh, great darkness lay behind us, we're not going to talk about it. And there's some non-Silmarillion drafts that were never completed that talk about humans being able to, when they first awoke in a different land, Hildoran, I think it's called, they could hear Iluvatar speaking directly into their minds, but Melkor showed up, and he got them to turn away from Iluvatar and worship him, and they lost the ability to hear from Iluvatar directly. And that's really all we kind of know about like early humanity. We don't get much, and the elves taught humans most of what the elves and humans know. Like, writing was taught to the humans by the elves. Dwarves, similarly, are very secretive about their beliefs within the story. They have their own secret language, Khuzdul, which they don't teach to non-dwarves, and presumably they have their own creation story written in Khuzdul in secret tomes underneath the mountains, but we don't ever see that. Now, we know in the Elvish version that dwarves were created by the Vala Aule, the smith, who the dwarves call Mahal. But we don't really get their own perspective on it. We only get the elvish perspective on the dwarfish creation story. And then hobbits, unsurprisingly, they don't do any introspection. They never contemplate their origins. They are also not actually a distinct race like elves and dwarves are. They're technically a sub-race of humanity. But to highlight how little that the difference between what hobbits think about their past and what humans do, we get this scene in The Two Towers. Frodo is with Faramir and the Rangers of Ithilien, and he sees them before a meal, standing in silence, facing the west before they sit down to eat. And he says, "What's that about?" And Faramir says, "Well, this is our tradition. We stand in silence and we look toward Numenor that was, beyond that to Elven home that is, which is Valinor, Aman, and to that which is beyond Elven home and will ever be, which presumably is the timeless halls of Iluvatar." And Faramir says, "Don't you guys have any traditions like that?" And Frodo says, "No, not really, but we thank our hosts for a good meal, and that's the extent of Hobbit traditions that we ever really hear about." So in the end, all we really have is the elvish account. But as some of the elves we see have personally talked to the Valar, it's probably an accurate account. Now, this is the note here that I said at the beginning when Sean asked about the Tolkien cinematic universe. Now, I believe he was probably just saying that as a catch-all phrase for, like, everybody in Middle-earth. But it is interesting. We're in an interesting place when it comes to cinematic adaptations of the material. See, almost everything I said today came from the Silmarillion. But the Tolkien estate has never licensed that for adaptation. So anything you ever see on screen is only allowed to come from the published Hobbit and the published Lord of the Rings. And there are the appendices in the Lord of the Rings that give a little bit more details on things, and they give timelines of past ages, and they allude to much of this, but little is explicitly said. So in terms of the TCU, you'll probably never see the creation story, or hear a direct reference to Iluvatar or any specific Vala, because nobody has the rights to it. So that was a pretty long answer, and I had to cut it short even because there's just too much to get into. I talked about the sun. Sun is younger than Galadriel is. That's a story for another day. But, Sean, I hope that answered your question at least a little bit. And in many ways, yeah, like I said, I scratched the surface. But hopefully that answered your question. And if you, like Sean, would like to submit a question to the podcast, email in at lotramapod@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer your question. If you've liked what you've heard, tell a friend, and feel free to leave a 5-star review. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff that you do. And Iluvatar willing, I'll be back next week. See you then.